Thank you very much. If I were a philosopher who spoke the truth, I'd now suggest you all went home or had a drink, because between them, the speakers today, and particularly Soren, Udo and Dave Archer, have said everything that I'm going to say. But because I'm a lawyer, and of course I'm paid by the hour, I shall be using the whole of my time in order to fulfill my bill to Ruth. So it's rather a sort of fairy story. Once upon a time, I was a very conventional legal academic whose work focused on the law of torts and veered towards highly practical expositions of legal analysis and did things like edit books called Clark and Linsell on torts, which was so heavy I couldn't lift it up. And then one day in the 1980s, I fell into bad company. I met John Harris, then a lecturer in philosophy, but in the Faculty of Education. That's another story that Harry and I can tell you sometime. The late Reverend Tony Dyson and Dr. Mary Lobjoy, who was the Deputy Director of the Student Medical Centre. And between us, we set up the Centre for Social Ethics and Policy in 1986 and started the MA in Healthcare Ethics. Note, we called it the Centre for Social Ethics and Policy. At that time, I think we were strongly of the opinion that we would move much more generally into the field of applied ethics and not be so very focused as we became on healthcare ethics. CSEP has grown. Our degrees have proliferated. We now have 4, an MA in Healthcare Ethics and Law, an MSc in Healthcare Ethics and Law, an MA in Healthcare Ethics and Law by Distributed Learning, and a structured programme in Bioethics and Medical Jurisprudence. And recently we had a very happy event. Thanks to the miracles of modern technologies, 2 fathers, John Harris and John Sulston, gave CSEP a sibling in the form of the Institute of Science, Ethics and Innovation, known as ISE. Now, when CSEP was born, quite differently really from ISE, we didn't have a business plan. We jumped through no hoops to get approval from the centre. We simply told our then 4 faculties, we were spread over 4 faculties then, education, law, theology and medicine, what we were doing, and we very easily won approval for a new degree, the MA, to which we very soon recruited Soren Holm, probably our most distinguished student, if not Moran, and now I'm going to get myself into very hot water because I'll find there are several others here. The whole creation of the centre was very much by accident, or rather a series of accidents. John and Tony met on a train going to debate against each other about surrogacy. John and Mary met because he'd been rushing madly around a squash court and had injured himself. And John and I met because a colleague who usually attended a philosophy seminar was very squeamish when he heard that John was going to talk about IVF and let me go as well. Now, I offer this self-indulgent trip down memory lane because it illustrates an age when intellectual enterprise and alliances could evolve rather than be engineered and were given room to grow. So, set no financial targets, we could make mistakes, and we made a lot. We could take time to learn how to work together and how to bring in others. When the university actually realised we existed, which took about 7-8 years, what counted was the intellectual enterprise, and the money we started to win from funding was, in a sense, the icing on the cake. I use that phrase deliberately because there's a lot of cake consumed in CSEP and ISE. There was, of course, a price to pay. In my early years, my teaching on the MA didn't count at all towards my teaching allocation in law. It was seen as a bit of a hobby. To me, when young, that was a small price for being left alone, for being out of the mainstream. Of course, there are all sorts of downsides for being out of the mainstream. But it does seem to me that in the UK, and I don't know if it's the same elsewhere, the budding of bioethics and law in Cardiff, London, Edinburgh and Glasgow actually began at that time of very minimal interference from the top. Well before we were all ordered to be multi, inter or cross-disciplinary, a lot of us were doing it. Now, it might look like age, the law professor coming close to retirement, looking back on better times. But I would suggest that time and space were and still are important to the development of both bioethics and law. I don't mean that we've got a right to demand that we lounge on the sofa and think, or that we've got no duty to account for what we do. But if we're to offer insight into the many dilemmas we address, insight, not instant answers, a great deal of reflection, reading, and conversation is needed. And there are 5 demons who get in the way of that. Most of the demons have already appeared today. Writing grant applications, knowing that most of them are going to fail, and increasingly having to adjust what you actually want to do to the awarding body. Udo has already talked about that. For me, the really infuriating thing is there are a number of things that I have done and have done with Soren and will do with Soren, which we need funding for. There are also lots of other things we could do without funding, but I will be expected to go and get funding for almost everything I do, including blowing my nose. Then there's publishing or die. Too much is published. Now, I'm as guilty as the next woman. But if we're to write fully, for example, about the adequacy of the law relating to saviour siblings, you need time to read widely on the ethics and the science, as well as the literature from your home discipline. You need to get it right, not get it published, get it right. Then there are the bureaucratic hurdles that require self-justification in one form or another on a weekly basis. If I was paid for the number of forms I fill in telling the university what I did, I'd be a very rich woman and I wouldn't be here today. Then there's another of the demons that Udo introduced, methodology. Reflection and thinking don't seem to count. Actually working out what you think of a particular subject rather than going around the room and finding out what everybody else thinks seems to be something that particularly law schools are driving you more and more towards. And then there's the demon of numbers. I think that CSCP has survived all these years, not primarily because of our research, though I'm tremendously proud of it, but because knitting us together year in, year out is the fact that we have a large number of master's students to teach. And we've got to agree, we've got to compromise, we've got to deliver, we've got to get on with each other. I say a large number because I think Manchester's recruitment to the master's programme is large in bioethics, but it's not large, of course, by the standards of the university. And so criteria that you've got to recruit 50 students to a particular class are going to be enormously damaging to all of us, both in terms of the fact that not all centres will meet those targets, but also in terms of the fact that the student experience changes radically once you become, as I suspect a lot of postgraduate taught degrees are, a sausage factory. Now, there are three other features of the Mancunian way I want to focus on this afternoon. The relationships between bioethics and law, the importance of what Marty Harry calls polite argumentation, and I'd like to come back but say just a little about the role that ethicists and lawyers play in policy making. I've stopped shouting, have I, just for the sake? Bioethics and law. Now, if I was to blow our own trumpet, I would boast that what Manchester was really good at is the and. We've been very lucky that we've so far maintained an equilibrium between the two, when I think there are other centres that do hugely good work, which tend to be a lot of bioethics and a little bit of law, or a lot of health law and a little bit of ethics. What concerns me today is that it increasingly seems to be assumed that the and is superfluous and that bioethics embraces law. And I know there are definitions of bioethics that do include lawyers. So as I speak, I am having a discussion with a leading publisher about the name of a series of books that will merge the medical law and ethics series with the bioethics series. And we thought it could just be called Bioethics and Law. Not terribly long, not too difficult to remember. But the publishers wanted to be just bioethics, because they think the tag law might put bioethicists off, almost as though the very presence of lawyers drives you into a fit. And in any case, I'm told it's unnecessary, because bioethics subsumes law. So am I just being a grumpy old woman, or am I, without realising it, a bioethicist? Now, there have been quite a few times today when I thought, I'd be quite happy to be a bioethicist, particularly when I was listening to Bob Baker. I thought, that's what I'm going to be. But I don't think I am, and I hope I'm not, and I hope I'm not insulting some of my closest colleagues and friends. Let me just take a quick survey. Hands up, those of people in the room who have a first law degree. So there are a number of you, but not the majority. And I want to offer several reasons why I think it is important to make some distinction between bioethics and law, but also to ensure that there is a healthy marriage and a marriage of equals between the two. I acknowledge that there's a whole range of arguments about names just for lawyers. I'm very old-fashioned in talking about medical law. I should be talking about healthcare law, except now I've found out that's passé and it should be health law. But that still focuses on ethics and law in the clinic and not science in the broader sense. So ought I to buy into the inelegant bio-law? Don't like it at all. It's enough to make me again want to be a bioethicist. So I shall resist and persist with my reasons why I'm not the same animal as Soren is, and they're in no particular order of priority. Law and ethics, of course, share a common core, addressing how we should live together in a civil society, the rights we may claim, the obligations we owe each other and the community, and the community is truly important for the lawyer too. But there is, of course, a crucial, almost a trite difference. Once the law is invoked, should becomes must. So thou should not kill becomes thou shall not kill. Second law of its essence very much depends on means of enforcement. The level of coercion will depend on the level of legal obligation imposed. Now, of course, once ethical principles are incorporated into codes of professional ethics, some ethical principles acquire a degree of coercive power. And for example, in the case of the mandatory principles set out for doctors by the General Medical Council or by bodies like the HFEA, the difference may be so small that there are increasingly people who refer to them as quasi-law, and I don't like that and disagree with that, but I can follow that argument again. But we have to think that the law always has sanctions, and that in the criminal law in particular, the sanctions are of immense impact from the very moment the criminal process is invoked. If you're charged with a criminal offence, of course it does matter at the end of the day whether or not you're convicted, but the horror of finding yourself at the wrong end of the criminal law can be compared with little else. So law is coercive in a way that ethics isn't. Crudely coercive. Ethics may be coercive, but it's politer, it's better mannered. And at least two consequences flow from the coercive nature of law. First of all, I think there has to be a very strong case to justify the judgment that because there is a consensus that X is unethical, it should be illegal. I think in the popular press and for many of our legislators, there's a far too great a tendency to conclude that X is wrong, ergo it should be illegal. I can't develop this theme fully today either, but it remains my view that we should be clear that laws can sometimes prevent bad behaviour, but it can't make women and men good. A doctor who obeyed the law to the letter could be a very bad doctor. Law is what we must do. Ethics are what we should aspire to. Now, of course, you'll be saying, I've been talking fiction, especially if I have listened to the talks today, in suggesting that in bioethics there'd ever be consensus on X, because the reality is, of course, there'd be vigorous debate. And for law, that debate is the debate that keeps us all in business, but it's a problem. Because if there's no consensus on the moral status of the embryo, how can you make laws? The lawyer must always try to answer two questions. What is my considered judgment on the ethical debate? And given the strength of alternative arguments, how far is it right that any of those options be enforced? Next, let's assume that it is justifiable to enforce some form of legal obligation. There's then a crucial question about what form should it take. Said before, the tendency today is if you don't like the look of X, criminalising it. I'd suggest that in so doing, we actually devalue the criminal law and we waste a whole lot of money. Now, listening to my reasons so far about why law and ethics are different, you may have thought, well, okay, there's some difference, but any of us competent bioethicists could do this task. A comprehensive grasp of the law in relation to bioethics perhaps isn't needed. But I would suggest that it is when you come to form, that technical legal knowledge, the sort of legal knowledge I used to deploy when I edited Clark and Linsell on torts, has become somewhat devalued. I set an exercise for my doctoral students. The whole of English law in relation to medical treatment under the NHS is not covered by the law of contract, it's covered by the law of tort. Contract applies if you're a private patient. So I asked them to think how medical ethics might be different if we had a contractual model rather than a tortious model. And they always shake their heads and think the woman's talking mad. It won't make any difference at all. And they always come back with actually a very different view. Heather talked this morning about global ethics. There are hardly any lawyers whose background is in public international law who've come into the field of working with bioethics. And that's a great pity, because I think their expertise is needed. There are, of course, the rare animals like Ruth who succeed in being both a bioethicist and a legal scholar, but they're very rare indeed. Reading some modern work by those who consider themselves bioethicists with a legal background, I wonder which, just as Soren was suggesting, some philosophers have lost their philosophical roots, whether there are some lawyers who've lost their legal roots. When addressing laws, again, as has been said today, a degree of compromise and pragmatism becomes right and necessary. Soren has written about how agreeing to disagree cannot resolve ethics. David has taught very powerfully about how when you move out of, if you like, your home discipline of applied ethics or philosophy, compromise becomes imperative. For the lawyer, it's an imperative and a skill we tend to neglect. Losing law in bioethics also overlooks that there's a great deal of important work in health law that has little apparent link to bioethics.